Good afternoon and welcome to the Orkney International Science Festival 2021 online, in this year of Scotland's coasts and waters. My name is Julie Rich, and it's my pleasure to be hosting this session from Orkney, along with our speaker, Dr. Tom Rendall, a regular here at the Science Festival. Tom was born and brought up on the island of Sanday in Orkney, where he spent several years farming before moving to the bright lights of Kirkwall. Tom became a familiar face in the tourist office for years before starting his academic career at Orkney College of the University of Highlands and Islands. Tom has spent 20 years researching the Orkney dialect and social history and is now the project leader for the oral history of the North Isles and part of the North Isles Landscape Partnership Scheme. I'm looking forward to hearing about life in the North Isles, Tom, and I will hand over to you and your talk on Tilley lamps, Wellstood stoves and water from the well.
Thank you very much, Julie, for that glowing introduction. Welcome everybody to my talk this afternoon. Helping me out today, though, with the readings is Egilsay Seater for Westray. Egilsay has a keen interest in heritage of Orkney, and she's also one of the team of the aforementioned project that Julie briefly introduced. So she's doing that now, but she's a former head teacher at Westray School, and she's also done a lot of Open University studies as well. So welcome aboard, Egilsay.
Thanks for that introduction, Tom, and I'm looking forward to helping you with your talk this afternoon.
Thank you. Yes, so we'll just probably go straight into the talk now, and the first slide is coming up there, and you will see on the first slide is a Tilley lamp and a Wellstood stove. Those, of course, were well, I found them in a shearer's shop, and Richard Shearer was very kind to allow me to go upstairs in his shop and take me photographs of that. A sparkling Tilley lamp there, something that I knew very well in my younger days. So if we go on to the first slide now, as you see there, the talk will actually include extracts from this book, the Third Statistical Account of Scotland, actually published in 1985. Now, we will feature the North Isles of Orkney with some archive images covered in the 1950s and 1960s mainly. We will look at a period of, I suppose, a transition in Orkney, really when the way of life seemed to change rapidly, and the writers from the islands really encapsulated this very well into their thoughts. So if I go on to the next slide. Now, the book, as you saw there on the second slide, was, of course, edited by Professor Ronald Miller, who was an Arcadian, and he gave a very good introduction to the book. And I'll be quoting from his introduction because they're very observant and help us understand the attitudes and the facets of life in islands at the time. Professor Miller was a professor of geography down in Aberdeen, as far as I'm aware, and has written other books on Orkney as well. So if I could have slide 4, please. And as you will see there, that's two actually comments from Ronald Miller, and he says in his introduction, of course, the large mechanized farms offer a much higher material standard of living, in most cases, worlds away from conditions in the 1950s. On the other hand, whereas the farmer of those days rested his weary bones in an evening in front of a cheerful fire in the Smith and Wellstood stove, and the hen's pot simmering at the back, his grandson is currently wrestling with a VAT and income tax on his home computer. But a visitor from the 1950s would find some very direct and personal changes in the home. Once rare, means water and electricity is now available almost everywhere, lightening the burden of the housewife, especially abolishing the weary trek to the well for water and the convention of the men to the stable and the women to the byre for certain functions. So that gives you a clue as to what the conditions were like even in the 1950s and then certain part of the 1960s in Orkney. So now we're going to move on to the first of the islands, and that's the next slide, please. That's 80. Now, this was written by James Robert Leask in 1957. Most of these pieces were written in 1950s, by the way. And Leask said that an increase of traveling facilities by land, sea and air have helped decrease the population. South Country is no longer a remote and mysterious land. Knowledge has increased, and a trip to Glasgow, Edinburgh, even London is nothing unusual, with the inevitable result that many have settled in our big centres. And then he goes on to say, many of the young men and women answered the country's call. They saw large towns, they visited other countries, they tasted the pleasures common in the great cities. After such times, it is not surprising that the narrow bounds of the farm servant and the old home life became intolerable, and that to fend them for themselves in the big world outside was their final decision. So, Ailsa, if you could do the next reading for 80, please.
It is possible that a large percentage of the population is of real old Orkney stock, that would be Norse origin, and only one or two instances can Fermin folk be traced to Incomash, locally called ferry loopers. We've been unable to trace a single instance in which intermarriage with South Country stock took place and the young gallant brought his bride back to the old homeland. Life is certainly much easier. The time was when the farm servant slaved 10 hours a day for a mere pittance, poorly fed and poorly housed. All this has changed, and we trust for the better, but much of the old independence and craftsmanship has gone.
Thank you, Ailsa. So that was Leask's sort of views on 80 being quite a small population. And we're going to go next to North Ronaldsay, and Peter A. Tilley wrote this. He wrote his chapter, though, in the 1980s, so he had already seen changes, whereas others hadn't experienced them. But he says there are changes in agriculture in the last 20, 30 years. Drinking bowls in the byres, which gradually did away with the turnips, and less cropping of cereal, and more grass and clover. The 1950s and 60s brought in educational centralisation, where youngsters over 11 years old were sent to Kirkwall Grammar School for their higher education. Very few seem to return, and certainly none who are interested in the higher branch of education, so the draining population still goes on. Next slide, please. And here we go. In 1962, Mr. P. Sutherland went out to North Ronaldsay to extend and improve the pier. So when the contract finished, the Orkney Islands Council also gave him the contract to supply the island with pipe water supply to all the households in Ireland, which was a very modern achievement at the time. North Ronaldsay, in fact, was the first island to get a pipe water supply in Orkney. The Memorial Hall served the island for many years, and dances would be held throughout the winter. Inter-island football matches with Sanday were held, and there was great rejoicing when they beat the much larger island. The singing of songs and the telling of stories were favourite ways of spending an evening, and much enjoyment was had by all. But that was yesterday, and now a new era has taken place. On the 19th of June in 1981, the new £80,000 community centre was opened by Lord Rousay. So that is North Ronaldsay. We're moving now to Shapinsay, because again, a fairly small population, now around about 300. In those days, it was about, I think, in the 60s, 50s, 60s, about 500. But Shapinsay, agriculture was quite an important part of the Shapinsay economy, and I'll just read the first lines. This was written, by the way, by Reverend James H. Boyd, and in 1950. So agriculture is the main occupational interest of islanders, and has progressed considerably over the years. Some 62% of the total acreage is under cultivation, and the main crops are oats, bere and turnips, mostly, if not entirely, for home consumption. As a farming community, the people of Shapinsay enjoy the advantage of having a mill on the island, also of having with Kirkwall daily travelling facilities, both for themselves and their goods. Generally speaking, the standard of living conditions could hardly be regarded as commensurate with the measure of prosperity enjoyed, although the responsibility in this does not rest altogether with the people themselves. Running water and electricity are not yet public services with us. Oops. Sorry about this, folks. Right, so I'll just move over now to Egilsay for the next slide, please.
Continuing with folk in Shapinsay, nor do the farm folk on the whole overindulge themselves in the matter of food and clothing, or yet in travelling. Plain fare and stout garments meet with most acceptance, being for the islanders part and parcel of a contentment with their lot, which, if it is open to some criticism, at the same time is not ill-founded and is not to be denied a true commendation. Socially and culturally, the life of the community in Shapinsay cannot be said to be overdeveloped. The majority of the functions are held in the community centre, formerly the Volunteers Drill Hall. A lesson in the better use of leisure hours could well be learned, particularly by the younger sections of the community and some of the older, both in their own homes and on public social occasions, might do more towards guiding them to better standards of moral and social life.
Thank you, Egilsay, for that. There's certainly some moralizing going on in that piece anyway. Now I'm moving on to a couple of photographs here, just by way of variety. First photograph there is Geordie Harkis, or Captain George Harkis on the ridge of the MV Arcadia. And this was the days, of course, when it was all sort of, well, no rows, everything had to be lifted aboard by crane and so on. And I'll photograph that later on. But not all the islands could get aboard into the pier. And the next slide will show you, which I think is a quite interesting slide. It's very grainy, the photograph is very grainy, but in fact, that's the Papay boat gone out to the main ferry, and this was traveling to some of the smaller islands, because what they did there, as you could see, was that they had this fairly small boat where at least I think there was 7 people aboard with no life jackets. At the somebody coming up a wee ladder there, and the person with the beret on there is, I think, Jimmy Junson for Westray, and probably I think Jackie Bain with the white hat on there, getting people aboard. And you'll note there that even though they're on a small boat, some of them are very well dressed, because this was the habit. When you get to the tune, you dressed very formally, out of respect, of course, for visiting Kirkwall. So that's just an example of some of the what they had to really endure during the 1950s and the 1960s. In fact, that was really the way some of them had to travel for the smaller islands. So now we'll go over to Strathspey, if I can, John, please. So Strathspey, now this was written by John Drever. John Drever was head teacher at the Strathspey School way back in the 1950s and 1960s. He wrote as follows: the great majority of people living here were born in the parish, but the ancestors of so many have come from Orkney, other Orkney parishes. So it is rather difficult to say whose forebears were in possession here centuries ago. Several women have come from further afield, thus bring new blood, which is generally a good thing. Mains electricity has not yet come, but in some houses there is a supply by battery. No electricity is generated by the wind. In the great majority of houses, oil lamps are still used. For example, Tilley lamps, and some colour gas is also used. There are 30 more cars, 2 hiring cars and 3 hiring lorries. Very few gigs are on the road now. The great majority of people are farmers. In summer, there are a few lobster fishermen, and in winter, rabbit hunters, as rabbits are very plentiful. Tractors are in common use. reapers and binders are employed in the harvest, and scythe only being used to cut roads. That was when you actually cut a wee section so you get a tractor down without actually tramping down your crop. And I have to be honest, I remember that in Sanday as well, because I have to sort of pause very briefly here and say a lot of these things I actually experienced in Sanday when I was a young chap. Anyway, a horse is very uncommon sight in the labouring time now. The days of the horse, lorry, and the gig have almost passed away in Stroncy, and their place has been taken by tractor and trailer. And the tractor and trailer, I should say there, by the way, just to add a thing again, would be used almost as a car for people that didn't have a car. So they used it for that sort of activity as well. The crime is practically non-existent, Drever says. A constable who serves in the North Isles resides here because there had been one in the herring fishing seasons. You see, the bad people come from the south. We do not keep them in Stroncy. So if I move on now to Rousay, Egilsay, and Wyre. Now, I've done this slide because I found it at the archives, and I think this just is the only time that I can have anything but Wyre. But this really indicates that, again, you have the MV Arcadia lying off there, obviously off Rousay there, and then the PD boat just coming in. You see the small white boat coming into the pier at Wyre, and the people again are being taken in because the boat couldn't, that size of boat couldn't get into the pier. So that was the MV Arcadia really well serving the island of Wyre. So if we go on to the next slide now, and I think Ilsa, if you could do the next slide for me, please.
In this 20th century, steadily rising costs made existence on the hillcrofts even more difficult and precarious. The Old Age Pension Act mitigated conditions for the older folk, but there was fresh inducement for the young to remain there. Most of the farms are family farms. There has been a great increase in the fertility of the farms, so they can perhaps carry 50% more than they did 50 years ago. During the present century, there has been a very noticeable improvement in housing. The old picturesque thatched roofs are steadily disappearing and being replaced by slates or some form of fabricated substitute. Few houses are equipped with modern sanitary conveniences, and wells and paraffin lamps have to be relied on for water and light.
Thank you, Ilsa. And you'll see there, before I do the reading, at this piece on Rousay, Egilsay and Wyre was written by Dr. Hugh Marwick, who in fact was formerly a rector at the Kirkwood Grammar School and then became Director of Education. But of course, he's also very well known for writing the Orkney Norn, which is a seminal work on our old language in Orkney, and was a great academic and started really a lot of people interest in dialect studies. So Marwick, of course, was born in Rousay and had a great affinity for the island. So I'll just do his final paragraph, which I know is rather lengthy, but I think it's important to read this because it's very well, as you expect, very well put together. If it be true what sociologists tell us, that a town-bred family does not survive 4 generations, the prospect of continuous rural and island population is dismal enough and a standing challenge which statesmen cannot afford to ignore. But over and above such political and utilitarian considerations, no one with any spark of sentiment can view with composure the possibility of such islands becoming desolate and deserted, islands from where some of the finest stock in the British Commonwealth has sprung, and with a history of human life and endeavour stretching back over a period of well nigh 4,000 years. So that was Marwick's parting shot, if you like, which is very, very philosophical and far-reaching. So now we're going to move to Sanday, which arguably is one of the better of the North Isles, and my home island, of course. And this next 3 slides will really speak on Shaundy Mackay, who was head teacher at the Sanday School, and of course I knew him very well He was a great prolific writer I should say, for the Arcadian, and he was a preacher as well. He was a man of all seasons, really, and he really helped me a lot with my early education after I left the school. But this is John D. Mackay's piece anyway on Sanday. At social gatherings of all kinds, there is no awareness of social class. Ministers, doctors, and teachers are often asked to make speeches, but this is not a sign that they belong to a superior class, but that their education has furnished them with the ability to address audiences and not become panic-stricken. Most farms on the island are now highly mechanized, so that fewer people are required to work them. A husband and wife can, with the assistance of a growing son, easily do all the work on a 50-60 acre farm. This would have been impossible in the 19th century when the crops had to be reaped with scythes or sickles and the threshing had to be done with the flails. External signs of wealth like the possession of a motor car or a large house do not count for very much on the island, especially if the owner of these perquisites show little interest in the welfare of the community. The unbiased observer will readily admit that the farmhouses in Sanday are of no great architectural beauty, and they have been too often erected without any definite plan in mind. Most people over 60 believe that the modern youth are much worse behaved than they ever were in the young days, but they can produce no evidence to show that this is true. And John D. Mackay goes on to then say that many professional men from Scotland and England have in the past mistaken the quiet speech, the somewhat slow reactions of the average islander for docility, and they've attempted to order him about. Such attempts have, however, always been doomed to failure, for the average Sanday man, and indeed the average Arcadian, acknowledges no one as his master and refuses to take orders from someone who is in no way superior to himself. The islanders themselves look upon the high freights and fares and the lack of daily mail as the greatest problems which they have to face in the isolated community. The complete inability of successive governments to do anything about it, and the negligence of the county council in attempting to deal with the matter, have convinced most island farmers that British governments were remarkably inefficient and are perhaps only interested in communities near London. So there we go. I thought I'd just show you this picture here, which is my grandparents, my grandparents Rendall. This is Thomas Rendall, of course, my grandfather, and I was named after him, and Maggie Ellen, his wife. Now, the interest in this picture is, if you look at the slide there, and you'll see the paper that's on the table. They're having their tea, by the way, at the old grate. But if you look at the paper there on the bottom of the slide, you'll see 10 years as Queen, which looks like this paper must have been published in 1963. So they would have been looking at that in that year while having their tea in the house in the meadow in Sanday. It was not taken by me because I would have only been about probably 10 or 11 at the time. But I thought it was a wonderful photograph, and it really fits into the period as well. So, of course, they came from the island of Westray, and as appropriate, I'm going to hand over to the Westray lass, Egilsay, for the next slide.
Thanks, Tom. This next bit was written by Reverend Henry R.M. Fraser. Almost all the population is composed of people born in the parish, and there are few immigrants, even from other parts of Orkney. A few have come from Shetland, while only one schoolmaster, 3 of the clergymen, the doctor, and the hotel proprietor are from the mainland of Scotland. There is no public supply of water, electricity, or gas in Westray. Most inhabitants have wells, either at their houses or within a short distance. This often entails expenditure of considerable labour, especially in dry weather, in carrying and carting water. Even the schools are lacking in proper toilet facilities, all of them being of a shockingly elementary kind. Dry lavatories are the normal provision, with the refuse being dumped either in the sea or on the farm dung heap. A few places have installed chemical toilets, and it is to be hoped that this measure of improvement will become extensive.
The position of Westray with regard to police service must surely be one of the most unusual in Scotland. One policeman, situated in Stransay, is responsible for the whole of the North Isles. Despite this hopelessly inadequate service, serious crime in Ireland is practically unknown. Minor delinquencies, which no doubt occur in Westray as in other places, seldom get the length of police action, for, to quote one of the islanders, we just hope they'll no do it there again. Unhappily, overcrowding is fairly common in Westray, especially in the small croft houses and in the smaller houses in the village. The young folk have been forced to move out in order to secure better homes. Typical Westray farmhouse is still built of the local flagstone with a stone front kitchen and roofed over with flags of the same material. So that's a kind of look at the sum of the writing. For the next to the slides, really, is going to be some photographs. You see there's some photographs here of boats, and I know there are 4 on the screen, which sometimes is a bit tedious, but I think to get a plenty in, I did this. The first on the upper left is the old Earl Thorfinn, the steamship Earl Thorfinn, and the company then was called Orkney Island Steam Navigation Company. That's Thorfinn at Sanday pier on the left. On the upper right, you'll see the type that I spoke about earlier on about the cargo all being handled, lifted aboard. That's a card being lifted aboard the boat there, going out to one of the islands, and it was then put in a hold, which was a very time-taking process. So some of the boats took a long while, especially the bigger islands, if they had lots of cargo to move. And I mean, on the bottom 2 slides, that is some people gathered around the pier at Kirkwell, where the boat is being loaded there, and then they're waiting to go aboard to go to one of the islands. The bottom right is the Arcadia and the Islander. That was the 2 ships that really served Orkney. The Arcadia came here in 1962 and served the islands until 1990, but she was just really so important in the services to the islands for all these years. And the next slide, please, is a slight change again. We're going, I think, to yes, we're going. I'm just looking to see what I'm here, but yeah, we're actually at Papay now. Papay wasn't included in the statistical account on this particular occasion, the statistical account, but some photographs here of Papay, and you'll see there a dance was held in Holland Farm, the barn of Holland Farm, in 1953 to celebrate the Queen's coronation. So again, look at the sort of formalities again of the guys, and everybody dressed in their Sunday best, if you must, to go to the dance in Papay in 1953. The next slide will show you some more pictures of boats, but I want to just to follow on the Papay Westray theme. If you look at the upper right photograph, you will see a Fergie tractor and some people being, I think it's an accordion there on a trailer, and some children going behind the trailer. And this, of course, is a picnic being held in Papay again to celebrate the Queen's coronation. The other 3 are all of the Arcadia. I felt that just because of quite an availability of photographs of Arcadia. That's at Gill Pier in Westray on the top left, coming into Sanday Pier on the bottom right. So that was the boat that, as I say, I mentioned before previously, that really served us well during the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And that's Arcadia on the bottom right, leaving, in fact, arriving at Gill Pier, the last SWI trip. Lots of trip days were held. And the next slide will show you a trip day there, excuse me, from one of the islands going to the Toon. note the large number of people gathered on the side of the boat, and an even larger number of people at the at the pier. That was like a crypt they used to be. Those things don't really happen anymore. And on the top slide, there, the top photograph, you will see the Earl Sigurd, the old Earl Sigurd, between the heads. And this is the boat actually going in rough water between the Calf of 80 and the Island 80 itself, going up to Westray, no doubt. And that was, it really was a frightening sight. And to be honest, the boat was rather hazardous in the winter months, but it did many trips out to the Isles. But that's going between the heads with the Earl Sigurd. And the next slide is something that I just realized when I was putting the slides last week. I finished them off last week, and I did this many a time over the years, cutting with a tractor. That's a Fergie tractor, and the binder. Can't see much of the bind, but basically that was how crop was cut. All these all these years ago, and it kept on going really on the farms really well into the late 70s, I would say, and even the early 80s. Combines are all they go now, of course, and there's stooks as well, and people working in the stooks, which was really quite a considerably labor-intensive job. So that was cut and crop with Petty Fergie at Bacheland in 80. So we're moving towards the kind of conclusion now. So the next slide really is the common issues. I'm just going to briefly mention as a summary of the issues that Ailsa and myself have been reading over to you over the last half an hour or so. And I mean, depopulation was very evident and mentioned by a lot of people, because it concerned a lot of the smaller islands and even the bigger islands. The drift of folk to Toon, or to Kirkwall, I should say, and other places. Housing conditions, as you see, were in some cases not great. The sanitation was even worse. I mean, people had to rely on outside toilets, and frankly, the outside buildings as well. So it was, the changes with the mains water and electricity made a huge difference for that. Ferry services, inadequate ferry services was mentioned, boats not coming every day. And of course, that's changed now with Row, but still people are not always happy with the ferries. So that's an ongoing problem. The needs for water and electricity was mentioned by nearly every writer, I think, in the North Isles, because they eventually got it, as you see, North Isles got it early, but by, I think, the late 1960s, certainly every island would have mains water, and the mains electricity came in the early 1970s, and I worked on that in Sanday as well, so I was involved with the development of the hydro in Sanday. A lot of changes in agricultural practices, as I mentioned. Much more mechanization, of course, has taken place now, but in the 50s and 60s, very labor intensive, especially on the small farms that couldn't already afford to really buy expensive and new, at that time, new implements. And social activities and community life, I think you got a flavor of that. It was just a different period in time. You had dances in bands, you had a lot of just, whist and euchre drives, you had lots of get-togethers, and of course, modern life has and of course, the COVID thing as well has affected us all. But the social activities which kept the communities alive, I think, in those times. So just to really sum up, really changes came to North Isles, mains water electricity from the early years of the 1970s. So I've just mentioned that. But folk moved from the islands, but there was a drift of folk to the Isles, and this really has helped to keep life in the communities. So the islands became, for a while, in the 1970s, depopulated. The population started to rise again, really once people moved in. So it kind of readdressed the balance a little bit. Housing conditions, of course, have improved in the decades following the 50s and 60s, and every house has bathrooms, showers, and so on now. And the sanitary conditions are so much better of what it was in those days. The Row services have really started to most islands, with the exception of North Isles and Papay yet. And I must mention that, of course, Loganair provided interline air service since 1967. So I think in all this speaking, really by the late 60s, Loganair was actually flying people to and from all islands. So that was good. And the air ambulance service as well. So that made a difference even in the late 60s. And finally, what is the future for the North Isles? What do the island folk think about this? Well, those questions will be examined in future lectures at the Science Festival, because as mentioned in the introduction, I am involved as project leader for the oral history of North Isles. Egilsay is doing some research along with a few others, and we're hoping to report on that next year, and it would be timely if we could report to the Science Festival on that. And just a reference and acknowledgements, thanks to, of course, Egilsay and the team here at the Science Festival for helping us out, the technical team. Thanks to Dr. Shearer at William Shearer's for allowing me to take photographs and having a yarn with him on the old times. Neil Lees gave me some information and guidance as well about doing some of the, getting some pictures for Tilley lamps and so on. And of course, the references from the third statistical account of Scotland, which I mentioned earlier, which is the book that contained all these readings. So thank you very much. That is the end of the presentation, and any questions will be welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom and Elsa. Gosh, those photographs remind me of a trip to Westray in the Arcadia many years ago, and I do remember it coming into Kirkwall, I think, on one of its last trips, full of bunting, lots of people doing the pier to welcome it in. You know, it seems like a long time ago. Well, the chat's been very busy. We've got lots of questions. So I'll just start. Here's one from Eric. He says, do you think that modern information technology could stifle the movement out and loss of people from remote communities nowadays?
Oh, interesting question, Eric. Yeah, I don't know. I suppose it could. It certainly changed things. Whether it's going to have a big impact, I don't know, because do remember that information technology is only part of the argument. Some people want more social activity as well. But I certainly think I think to answer the question, whether it stifles, I think it's certainly in the bigger islands, and maybe Egilsay would maybe help me with the Westray situation as well. But I know in Sanday, people now can set up businesses in Sanday, and the people have moved to the island to set up those businesses because they can control it by information technology.
Yeah, I would just.
Thank you.
Tom, I would back up what Tom is saying. We have quite a few families that have actually moved into Westray. Yeah. And one of the reasons they've moved is because they already had an existing online business. And so long as you've got a reasonably good internet connection, you can do that. We've got a family where we've got a very talented lady who makes children's clothing, and she can run her business for Westray because it can all go online. Yep. So I don't know whether it would halt folk moving out, but I would say it's helping against depopulation, because it's encouraging folk to move in, because you can have the best of both worlds where you can still run your business, but folk are liking islands such as Westray or Sanday or any of the islands in Orkney, because it's seen as having that quieter, more peaceful lifestyle, but you can still be working at the same time.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. And also Eric cheekily asked, from the text that you were reading out, what immoral life was going on in Shapinsay.
Well, like again.
I can't answer that, of course, because we might get some insights into that with the project, because I still have one or two people to speak to. But you see, a lot of people, Julie, and of course anybody who's listening in the world actually, is that lots of things happens in islands stays in islands.
And also, although it might have been called immoral, a lot of that might have been decided by the kirk, who would have had quite strict ideas on what was considered immoral, and maybe what was considered immoral then, folk would not even notice nowadays.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Thank you. You'll maybe find out though as your research goes on. We've got one from Rich here. He says, what was the single single thing that contributed most to the change of lifestyles in the islands?
Oh, well, I think, to be honest, as I kind of mentioned, I think the main's water and electricity, because from my own experience, because certainly I did when I was a wee boy, a pity boy in Sanday, we had Tilley lamps, we had colour gas. It was very primitive in that sense. But when you got even the mains electricity, you could get electric fires. My mother could get an electric washing machine, for goodness sake, all sorts of things like that. And that was a huge boon. And we could actually, the first lighting plant that we had in Sanday was 1 3/4 kilowatts. That would hardly run an electric fire. So that gives you a clue. So I think that I think was the main contributor to the sort of the islands development. Yes, I think that the whole, it seemed to change rapidly, as I said, there in the 70s. I think it's just there a time for change. And I think what I'm just said about the services and also the mechanization made a huge difference in a very short time.
Yes, I'm sure it did. And thinking about electricity, Eric says, you think life in Orkney will go back to these standards where the changes demanded zero carbon?
Oh, that's a big question and a difficult one to answer in a very short time. But I don't know. I think it'll be better managed. What I mean? So I think at islands, all islands. I don't live in Ireland anymore. Egilsay still lives in Westray, but I think all islands are very aware of all the emissions and so on now. And I think they'll take it on board, and I think it'll all be. Well, I think they will contribute to the economy through that way. I think anyway. I don't think it'll change much.
And also bear in mind that Orkney is actually a world leader in renewable energy. So we're at grid capacity in Orkney when it comes to things like wind turbines. So I think you could still meet all your carbon targets without having to feel like you're going backwards. I wonder if that was what the question was. Maybe I've misunderstood the question. But I think you could embrace and use the new technology to meet all the carbon targets, but not feel like you're going backward to living in the dark ages, because there are so many advances. I mean, every 2 or 3 years you have more advances, and the next thing I think might possibly come for the wind turbines will be storage in batteries. And so it was one of the readings spoke about the fact way back in the 50s, Tom, that a house had a Tilley lamp but also had a battery, I think, that they could get some light for.
Yes, and I've just
gone full circle.
I'll briefly mention that indeed. Yes, some of the people have been interviewed already for the oral history project has said that some of the smaller houses did have tiny wind generators and did that as well. And I think, as Egilsay said, I think carbon emissions it'll be well addressed, and I'm sure that the communities will embrace all the changes. And as you said, Egilsay, the wind turbines in the islands have meant a huge difference to the quality of life there, certainly in Sanday and Westray and other islands as well.
Yeah, interestingly, my folks married in 1961, and me mum was lucky enough to grow up on a farm that had a turley-whirly, the kind of old-fashioned forerunners to windows, I suppose. So they had light, although it was very flickery. And me dad then had to teach her who to work a Tilley lamp, because she'd never had to work a Tilley lamp, so she had to be taught how to do it, because she came for a wee laugh piece that had a turley-whirly.
I love a turley-whirly. Anyway. I'm sorry, but we don't want to take up too much time. So lots of questions, is there?
Yes, and we've got one here from Martin. I know that there used to be a lot of horses in Orkney at one time. I remember my dad saying that his grandfather had 2 horses. And Martin says, amazing, the horse-drawn carts and farm machinery was still in regular use in South Friesland when he was a bairn in the 1970s. Mm-hmm. Do you think it was a bit slower to sort of mechanisation to come to the North Isles, or was it kind of the same all over Orkney?
Well, can I answer that? Because I think we left those times. I would certainly say by the time I was sort of a teenager and so on, horses were, well, I mean, there were very few horses. In fact, I didn't know any horses, I think, used for work purposes by the early 60s. So I think, it's certainly, I remember as a PD boy, we had a horse on the farm, but really it was very, very limited. I think the tractors was coming on stream by the early 60s.
Yeah. Okay. And one final question here from Bill. He says, is there any evidence of how health improved as services came to the islands and how this affected movement of people from or to the islands?
That was health, was it? Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, certainly, as I mentioned there, coming towards the last of the slides there about Loganair, Loganair made a huge difference because people used to wait to go in the lifeboat or even with the ferry, which took, well, sometimes 3 hours. Loganair planes could take them in roughly 20 minutes, half an hour. That made a difference. So I would say that that is improved the quality of life, and certainly in the days gone by, there were doctors in every island. I have to tell you that now, and you also know about this as well, in some of the islands now, they're concerned about the lack of doctors again, because we don't have a resident doctor in some of the smaller North Isles. So health, I suppose, improved to some extent, as you could get in quicker and people with heart trouble could get, attended to before it was too late. However, I think that the sanitization made an awful difference as well. So I think people were more aware of health or what it was. Having said that, I showed you my grandfather's picture and grandmother there. They were brought up when hygiene wasn't so important, and yet they seemed to live a fairly long life. So I don't know, but I say overall, I think yes, the health of the people, both mental and physical, I would like to think is improved, yes, since the 70s. Yeah. Do you think so, Ailsa?
Yeah, I think I would agree. And just thinking on just the effort it was sometimes to keep water at home, and that fell mainly to women or youngins. And you think about the number of women who expect to work either part-time or full-time, that simply would not be possible unless you have water and heat water coming out of your tap, and unless you can turn everything on at a switch. There's no way you could have an automatic washing machine, even with an old lighting plant. So things like that, I would say particularly for women, have transformed their lives.
Yeah, that's good. Well, this has been very popular, so I do hope you both come back next year and tell us how you're getting on with the project. And thank you both, Tom and Ailsa. And our next event is at 3:30, and we're going to delve back into Orkney's prehistory, to the Iron Age, and to the mysterious Broch Towers and story of discovery in Orkney that started in the 1970s. And if you're enjoying the festival, folks, please consider donating. Full details on how to do so is below. And don't forget to like us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and also YouTube. You can like and subscribe so that you can see all our talks. And we also have the Festival Club, which will be on at 9:30. So we'd love to see you there. It's very informal and a chance to chat to maybe some of our speakers from today. So do come along to the Festival Club. And thank you all, everybody, and the tech team, and we'll see you again. Goodbye.